So welcome all to the Props Assist the House, Restoring the Homestead, Part 3. My name is Anna Plummer, and I am the Tell It Slant Poetry Festival Assistant. And I am so excited to be with you for today's program, where we are going to hear from Emily Dickinson Museum Executive Director Jane Wald and Historic Preservation Architect Jeff Baker. This program is the third installment of a series we have been running this summer. In parts 1 and 2, you can learn more about the past work that has led the museum to this project, which is our largest restoration undertaking yet. And you can also learn about the evidence we have discovered that supports our work in recreating decorative finishes in Emily Dickinson's home. These recordings are available to view from the bottom of the page for this program in our festival platform. Along the way, you are welcome to contribute a comment in the chat, and we would especially like to encourage you for this session to contribute questions as we go to the typed Q&A feature, which you can access in your Zoom toolbar at the bottom of the screen. And there will be time at the end for Jane and Jeff to address these questions. We are using auto transcription today, so you can turn on or off these closed captions using the live transcript button also in your toolbar. And now it is my pleasure to introduce Emily Dickinson Museum Director Jane Wald, Executive Director of the Emily Dickinson Museum. In her nearly 20 years at the museum, Jane has led many critical restoration and infrastructure projects that ensure these historic houses remain standing for another century and beyond. So thank you, Jane.
Thanks so much, Anna. And let me extend a warm welcome to all of you who are participating in this session too. I'm just so glad that we can include this conversation about restoring Emily Dickinson's house in the Tell It Slant Poetry Festival. I'm just really so pleased to be here today with Jeff Baker, a preservation architect who I think by now knows more about the homestead and the evergreens as buildings than anyone else ever has. So this is going to be a really terrific, next hour. So just briefly, Jeff has been with Mesick, Cohen, Wilson Baker Architects for more than 3 decades and has been a partner in the firm for more than 20. After his graduation from Hudson Valley Community College, Jeff attended Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, where he earned a bachelor's of building science and a bachelor's of architect. His firm, Mesick Cohen, specializes in architecture, planning, and historic preservation, and has overseen quite a number of previous restoration projects at the Emily Dickinson Museum, as well as numerous other important historic landmarks. Some of them include Thomas Jefferson's Monticello, Thomas Jefferson's other home at Poplar Forest, James Madison's Montpelier, and the Newport Country Club in Newport, Rhode Island. Jeff has also been retained to assist in the restoration of George Washington's Mount Vernon. So this is, so we feel very fortunate to have been able to entice Jeff to come help with Emily Dickinson's house and that of her brother, the Evergreens next door. So these are really fascinating sites that you've worked at over all this time, Jeff. And I'll bet we would love to hear about how you came into this line of work, and especially the historic preservation angle of architecture.
Well, first of all, I'd like to thank you for having me here. It's been a real honor to be involved in this project. It's been especially a privilege to work with the museum, working with you, Jane, for many years now. It's also an honor to be able to show this project to everyone out there. I came into this quite by accident. And I think when I speak with many people in our field, I feel that many people sort of fall into it by accident. I've been a partner here for now about 25 years, but I guess I've always wanted to be an architect. And I say that I have a few images perhaps I'll show, because I wanted to describe for you just very briefly about me, but more about our work. I'm very interested in because it all builds to to this project here. Let's see. I am going to go to the next image. I always have this blank image up, and it's slow.
I know it's coming. We saw this before. It's coming along.
Well, I think what I'll do is I'll keep describing a little bit about me very quickly. I grew up in a local town here in a housing development where all the houses were essentially all the same, and there were 6 different styles, and there were 650 homes, and I realized as I was growing up, it seemed like there should be something more to life around me. So one day, my father came into my bedroom and said, "Hey, you ought to see this television program." And the television program is about a house where the water flows through the living room. And this is a very unusual thing for my father to do. So I thought I should get up and see this. Well, it turns out it was about Frank Lloyd Wright's famous Falling Water. And at that point, my life changed. I saw what art and architecture could be and how life could be different. And I think I'll just get out of this. From that point, I won't go through all the details of my education and everything, but I eventually worked for a 2-person firm. I went to a small trade school first, which was actually a savior for me. Then I ended up joining this firm, and I was interviewing here, and I saw all these amazing things on the walls. And I just wanted to be an architect that designed wonderful things. But I saw, wrought iron, and I saw tiles that were specially made just for these projects that were in the office. I saw, plaster work, and I saw all these stained glass and carpets that were specially made for restoration projects. And I realized, there's just no other place I'm going to have an opportunity to be able to work with these types of specialized materials. I'm not going to be able to, put this into any kind of modern architecture. First of all, clients just really aren't willing to spend that kind of money, frankly. But also, I was fascinated in the forensics of it. I was fascinated with just sort of discovering what historic buildings were. It was just this sort of adventure I embarked on, and I didn't realize I was going to be on. And I thought, I'll just give it a few years, and then I'll just go back into regular architecture. Well, that was about 40 years ago. And the reason is because, you never stop learning something every day. We were a fairly regional firm. We were working on some fantastic projects. I had some mentors here in the office. Specifically, John Mesick was my older partner, who's now retired, and he is a brilliant man. He's retired now and enjoying his retirement, working on old buildings still. But we were working on the New York State Capitol. We were working on courthouses around the state and in the region, and using all these wonderful materials and working with all these wonderful craftspeople. And I just never got tired of doing that. So I stayed with the firm after my graduation, and I thought I'd bounce around a little bit, but I'm still here, and now I'm a partner in the firm. In fact, I'm the oldest partner in the firm. So it's been a real joy. The interesting thing about working here is that we were a regional firm, and I'll have to tell you a quick story. We were always considered ourselves a regional firm, and we had a historian working for us by the name of Mark Peckham, who's now at the New York State Historic Preservation Office. Anyway, a request for proposals came in for a project called Blair House. The Blair House is the guest house for the President of the United States in Washington, D.C. It's situated right across the street from the White House. And the partners saw this and said, well, they'll never hire an architect out of Albany, New York to do this. It's just not going to happen. And so they happened to go out on a business trip for a week, and Mark came out of his office and said, guess what? I applied for the job. He didn't tell anyone. And so when the partners came back, lo and behold, we were invited to go to this interview, and they got the job. And so after that, it sort of elevated our firm to a more national level, and that led to projects in various parts of the country, all the way up and down, certainly the Eastern Seaboard. And we've made a lot of connections since then, and that sort of spilled into working at the University of Virginia on Thomas Jefferson's buildings there, and that led to working on Monticello, and I've been working on Monticello for about 30 years, on and off. And then, as you mentioned, Jane, at Poplar Forest, Thomas Jefferson's secret house outside of Lynchburg, Virginia, and many others. What was really interesting in all of this time is that I've also learned a lot about how these craftsmen actually made the materials to actually make these buildings. And so when you look at how they're put together, when you actually have to make your own brick and actually have to make your own mortar and make your own plaster for some of these projects, you understand how these buildings actually go together. And so when you understand how they go together, you also understand how they fall apart, which is helpful. And you also understand sort of the layers of interventions, not only the original construction of any particular building, but you understand all the interventions over the years that these lives that have been sort of overlaid on these structures have left their mark. And all those marks, we're all products of our own time. The materials we use, the ideas that we have, the ideas that are embodied in these buildings can also be segregated by time. And that's how we're able to evaluate our historic buildings. We can go through and look at things, yes, stylistically, but if you go down, actually even down to the microscopic level, there are differences between, say, paint layers. You can see there are certain additives in the paints that were, used after certain dates. You can look at things like hardware, how it evolved over time. All these different things puts together a larger and broader picture for us, so that when we go to evaluate a house, we can sort of segregate what those layers are. And in a project like the Emily Dickinson Museum, we're able to just take a look at what our quote period of significance was, which was the period that Emily lived in the house and her family. And we're able to sort of isolate those periods and then begin to unearth and discover what she would have seen in her lifetime. What I'm fascinated about working on this museum is that Emily Dickinson saw this museum. This was sort of her world. I mean, for a long time, this represented, what her entire environment. She didn't go too far out of where she lived for a large portion of her life. And I'm fascinated by this, that what we're trying to do is trying to unearth what she would have known, what would have sort of informed her as she looked out the window. What did she see? What inspired her?
Yeah, I think we'll get into this in a little bit more detail later with things that you're going to show us. But seeing when we go into the house today, before restoration, we see how the house ended up in the 20th century and now 21st century. And what you were saying about these layers of time, peeling back those layers to see, the period after Emily Dickinson's death, the period close to the end of her life, the period maybe when the family, lived out at another house on West Street, and then the period when she was born in the house. These are all, they're all different configurations that are just so interesting to pull apart and piece together to figure out just what exactly the house looked like and what she was witnessing at different points in her life. It's just really, really fascinating.
Yeah, I have to say, what's unique about particularly the Homestead, I have to confess, the first time I came into the Homestead, I thought, oh, wow, there's really nothing left here. Yeah. And the sense that has been completely changed over. It was, as you say, it represented sort of the final layer, and it's very difficult to imagine what layers came before it. But as it turns out, one of the unique things about the homestead is that those layers, sometimes in other projects, the layers are just paint layers or carpet's missing and it's been replaced. Well, here you have physical layers. You have floors that have been put in, you have walls that have been put in over other walls. And so there's this encapsulation of the original house in underneath it all, which was shocking, frankly, shocking to me. And to be able to go back and start peeling those back has been a real joy.
Yeah, you know, when I first came to the museum, I think it was sort of generally accepted that there wasn't really any restoration that could be done until you showed up. So, so that's been great. I mean, you know, and thinking about all this time you've been working with us, you know, you and I started working together, I think it was in 2004, 2005, but actually our connection goes back a little unknown to us, just a little earlier than that. A couple of years before we started working together was when the Homestead and the Evergreens merged. And at that time, we were such a small little operation that we thought, well, you know, if we don't have any money to do actual work, we can at least do some planning, which started with a conditions assessment report, just examining what was going on with the homestead and the Evergreens, with the buildings, and then also with the collections. And maybe you could pick up there because of the person that we had in common.
Right. Well, there's a gentleman by the name of Eric Radoya who was retained by the museum, I believe, to do something like a 2-day assessment.
Right.
I think you go through, you look at it for 2 days, you write up a report. And his report was really excellent, by the way. We saw this report. Actually, I think that was one of the reports we looked at when we hired him. And so we ended up being connected to the museum through Eric, and Eric worked for us, I don't know, it's probably about 10 or 15 years. Now he's the director of restoration over at historic Deerfield, and we're still very closely connected with him. We're also friends. But he worked on the project throughout that 15-year period, and so yeah, that's sort of how we were able to sort of get our nose under the tent at the Emily Dickinson Museum, if you will.
Yeah. I'm gonna see if we can start a little bit of a walk through this.
Yeah.
Is that showing up? Do you see?
I can see it. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
That's the cover of that conservation assessment report.
Yeah. If you go to the next slide down or the next image down, you see that. I think what was important also, before even Eric worked on the building, there was a historic structure report done on the main house, on the homestead, and that report really showed it really segregated those layers, if you will, for us. I think Myron Stockhue, I believe, did that report with others, and Myron did a wonderful job on that report, and it also it described, you know, the original homestead house was built long before Emily was born, and so it was an 1813 quote federal period house, and then it was modified in the 1840s. It was modified again in the 1850s. It was modified again in the 1880s. It was modified again in the early 20th century, in about 1914 or so, and so there was all this evolution of the house, and it made it very, very both interesting and challenging to sort of unravel all of those different periods. And what was also really important, you know, it was amazing. The last owner before the museum had it, the Park family, they recorded the house in ways that no normal person would. Before they did their own layering onto the house. So they went through and they photographed all the way around the exterior. I wish they had gone into the interior. And they also hired an architect to draw the floor plans of the house. That was just an amazing thing. So very unusual for its period.
Yeah. So here you can see on the left of your screen, that's the floor plan of the house when it was first built.
So
And
Jane,
Oh,
sorry to interrupt. Just want to let you know we're stuck on the first slide, which is a blank slide. I think you have to go into your presentation mode.
so it is in presentation mode. Can you see, has it changed? You see historic photos?
Nope. Maybe. Sorry, go ahead, Anna.
you may want to change which tab you're screen sharing if the presentation itself has opened in a new tab.
Let me stop share. Okay. And then I'll go back.
Aha,
There we are.
that looks good.
At last, success at last. All right. So these are among the exterior photos that you're referring to, Jeff.
Yeah, they took quite a few exterior photos, and there was a barn or a carriage house that was right behind the main Homestead house. This happens to be an example of one of the photographs of the north side of the house, the rear side of the house, which had what they call an L on it. And that's where the servants' quarters would have been on the second floor, and on the first floor would have been a kitchen and a laundry and other rooms that helped to support the main house. It was really, though, important that we had some of this information, and I guess we had also similar information, not quite the same, on the Evergreens, which is Austin's house next door.
Yeah. So this merger that I mentioned, where the Homestead and the Evergreens came together in 2003, gave us an opportunity, really for the first time, to think about the site as a whole. You know, the property, the remaining 3 acres of the Dickinson property, and the 2 houses that sat on that property that Emily Dickinson's family owned. And again, these were our early days, and what did it make sense to do? Just to get us started with a new museum, a new mission, a new strategy, and it seemed like a master plan was called for. And this has just been I think is one of the best. This is probably the best move we could have made at that time. But that's really how Jeff and I began working together more closely, is because his firm was engaged to do this master plan.
Yeah, we've done a lot of master plans over the years, but what was really interesting about this one, it was 2 houses and the landscape. And so pulling all that together, and I believe you did a cultural landscape report at the same time. So you had the historic structure report, now you had the cultural landscape report, now you're a master plan. And so we were able to sort of put a step-by-step process together of how do you turn this into a larger museum someday, and what steps do you have to take. And so some of those were something simple, like on the interpretive side is what they call the period of significance. What's significant about the site? Well, that's pretty easy. You know, it was Emily Dickinson's house, and so I think we worked with the museum to define what that period was. I mean, because Emily lived in the house a long time, and there were a number of large decorative things that happened in that house over that period. And then we also prioritize the approach. You know, how do you keep, what do you do first? And so obviously, you know, we divided those up from critical and urgent, necessary, and desirable things. But you know, trying to keep water out of the house and keep the house from burning down was a big deal. So those are the number one things, and then we just sort of, you can see in this slide, we went right down the list. The other thing that was important was to have an understanding of how do you interpret such a house? What do you show everyone? How do you tell Emily's story? And we recognized that roughly maybe 1/3 of the house was filled with offices, because there were not any other buildings to put them in, and this is common. And so the idea was, well, how can you get to a point where you can interpret as much space as possible and still serve the public? So I think that we're slowly moving in that direction. And of course, we developed sort of these flow charts of, when you're looking 10, 15 years out in the future, it's almost impossible to know exactly which path you're going to take, but we put these flow charts together as to what the various paths could be. I think actually we have a restoration plan A and a B. I think it actually turned into a C in real life.
Yeah, one thing I've always loved working with these charts, because to me they've become kind of checklists, and it's just been so satisfying and gratifying to be able to do the right thing for the houses and to be able to work systematically through the issues that needed to be taken care of. So that's been a real gift of the master plan also. So so we've been through a whole lot of experiences at the homestead, including there was this one day in 2009 when so this is just basically an anecdote. I'm sure a lot of our participants have might recall when this happened, but I'll just tell this one and then we can move into the current project. But there was this day in 2009 when there was a kind of a crumbling sound, and the crumbling sound turned out to be the ceiling in this room, in the room from which this photograph is being taken, where the ceiling just fell into the room for some kind of historic architectural practice reasons, but anyway, the thing that required us to take out all the ceilings in the house, and that gave us this real great opportunity to study things about the structure and the building history that we wouldn't have known. That incident, it was really very fortunate that, of course, no one was in that space at the time, but a kind of amusing thing that I'll always remember about that day is that one of our visitors that day was Robert Frost's granddaughter. And, you just kind of wonder, is there kind of a Dickinson Frost thing going on there? But so that I think you've got some. So Jeff, are these slides from that time where
they are? It was fortunately the ceilings had already been replaced once, so we didn't lose any historic fabric. But of course, there was a lot of head scratching. I had to put the head scratching slide in there. But what we did was we were able to use this as an opportunity to discover a lot more about the homestead than we ever would have dreamt. So we were able to study the structure and study what happened to it. And as you can see from that earlier slide, I don't know if you saw the floor plans, the house changed, evolved over time dramatically. And so really what we're working with here are remnants of all these earlier periods. You see on the right-hand slide, there was a little arch in the ceiling. That's because there was a fan light or sort of a transom light over the front door. That's not there anymore. It's a whole different design now. So you see also layers that we found described as layering in the house. And when the ceilings came down, they had actually been lower than the original ceilings by several inches. And what that did was it revealed layers of wallpapers and paint schemes in these various rooms that existed before those ceilings were put in. And so we quickly went to work, and these are my field notes of all the little things that we found throughout the house. And of course, I'm an architect, and all these molding profiles that you see around doors and windows is a language to me and other people that are in my field. And we can actually see how these moldings were modified by Emily's family to sort of keep up with the Joneses, if you will. And so we could sort of start to unravel sort of this layering. So to get it right within Emily's time. And, we were in Emily's bedroom. We can actually start to see when we started doing even more evaluations of the house, that there was actually a fireplace in her bedroom early on, but then in her period, there was a stove. And the amazing thing about the last owners of the house, they saved everything. And there was a little garage out in the back that's still there, and they saved all the mantelpieces and doors and all the stuff that they pulled out, almost as if they were looking forward to the day that someday the house would be restored. So we were able to use Emily's stove. We were able to use evidence of the what we call the chimney piece, which is the mantle around the opening. We were able to do paint analysis throughout the house, and we're essentially able to put the bedroom back together again as she would have known it. And
Yeah,
part of that,
all of that. Yeah, all of that is so. It's cumulative, you know, the work you've done over the years. It's cumulative to allow us to, you know, to do this much larger project and get it right.
Right, and you know, one of the you know, Emily was fond of her conservatory, and tragically, it was sort of disappeared, I think, in the early part of the 20th century, but it made it into the era of photographs, and we had pieces and parts of this. There's a door, there's a shutter, and all stored away. They sort of disassembled it and they saved a bunch of pieces and put it away. And so we also looked at evidence on the house, what we call ghosts or pink ghosts on the house, on the exterior of the house. And we're able to know exactly what the form of this was. Archaeology was done, so we had the footprint, and we were able to recreate it in a computer graphic off to the left. And then this is the real thing, just as it's finished on the right.
Yeah, just. It was just, you know, when I saw it finally assembled and finished, to me, it was just perfect. It was just perfection.
Well, we were very fortunate to have a man by the name of Peter Ham, who was a regional craftsman whose work is just exceptional. And he also knows what he's looking at when he looks at historic fabric. One of the things we're showing here is, you know, now we're getting into a project where we have to infuse building systems into the house. One is because the systems are severely lacking, but also at some point there'll be collections in the building here, and so there has to be a proper environment within the house. And so I'm interested in technology. So about 5 or 6 years ago, we got into three-dimensional laser scanning, and so we're now laser scanning our buildings, so I almost don't have to measure anything. And then we turn that into super accurate floor plans. And the importance of this is, when you do the laser scanning, you can actually slice the house like a loaf of bread, and you can look into the end of it. And that's how we're able to really closely look and see how we can bring arteries and veins of systems through the house and minimize any damage to the original historic fabric, and also minimize any visual impact for the visitors.
Yeah, I remember an early project, you know, long before this technology, where we were, I think it was one of the systems projects, or maybe it was replacing an electrical system, but sort of banging into a double brick wall that, you know, was, you know, could have easily been revealed with this technology, but was not so back then. Yeah. Yeah,
and we're finding cavities and things, and so you think, okay, what's behind that wall? Things that you don't really realize are there. And then that gives you the ability to do some exploratory work. And then what we're able to do, we're talking about the entire house and its next door house at the Homestead and its landscape. And so we take drones and we're able to drone the house, and that makes like a three-dimensional model automatically of the whole house and its landscape. And so we're able to use that as a basis of not only our working drawings, but also to start to recreate what we think the site actually was. If you remember that historic photograph that I showed you with the barn, archaeologists have found, and we have earlier maps of exactly where that barn was situated in Carriage House. And so we're able to put together sort of a landscape that is what it was. But the importance of this is not so that that'll be recreated right now, but that someday it may be recreated. And we're running a lot of underground systems into the house. And so this enables us to sort of avoid these areas of interest archaeologically, and also plan for the future. So when we're designing systems, if that barn ever comes back, for example, we're not going to put our electrical panels right where the barn was.
Yeah.
And so what we're able to do is that slide off to the right-hand slide is the blue represents where the barn was in the upper right, the present-day garage on the left, and the main house down in the blue on the bottom. And so we're designing our systems around where these buildings either are or were.
Yeah, and this, so the gray, the heavy gray lines in close to the center of this slide on the right. That's part of this project right now, running those lines, planning for the future.
Right.
Yeah.
And so as part of this, we're able to record, it's a kind of, it looks very strange, but that's the existing stair, which is what we call a Colonial revival stair from the early 20th century off to the left. And then we discovered pieces and parts of that stair are actually the stair that Emily knew and walked up and down. And so what we've done is we've taken some of the pieces and parts and been able to recreate that stair on paper off to the right. I think the next slide shows, yes, you can see we're only missing, I think, 16 or 17 of the original balusters that Emily would have known. And we knew that it would have had, from the 1850s, it was an 1850s stair, it would have had different finishes, it would have had perhaps a different newel post. So we did a probe in the floor, it's very difficult to see, but sure enough, right where we put our probe through the later period flooring, the modern flooring, there's a rectangle there, which was the base of the newel post at the bottom of the stair. That's right. And then if you look, we took off some of that sort of fretwork on the sides of the stringer of the stair, and this may have been shown in another presentation, but an earlier one, but we found that it was actually grained to look like walnut. Right. Whereas the balusters were walnut, but the rest of the stair was grained or faux painted to look like walnut.
Yeah, so this is, this is one of those almost breathtaking things about how the Park family saved materials. For what reason?
Who would save?
Yeah.
Well, the other thing, they also, like I mentioned, they took photos of the outside of the house. You look very, very closely on the left-hand side of that front door. There's a little plaque on it. There's glass in it, and there are two what they call pilasters adjacent to those doors. Those are two sort of columns that are up against the house. Yes, that's a photograph off to the right. Shows the later period, Park period, early 20th century changes. They broadened the opening and they put side lights in and changed the door, and they took away two of those pilasters. Well, all that evidence is still there in the brickwork, but having the photographic evidence is sort of a miracle to have these two things. And then we're able to take that evidence that we know and again recreate this on paper. So you can see the door that Emily knew off to the right as we're reconstructing it. How do we know so much about that door? Well, I think if you go to the next image, there's the door. It was saved by the Parks in the garage. And if you look very, very closely, there are sort of these fragments of glass in it. And that glass had sort of this etched work around it. I happen to have a piece of that right in my hand.
Oh, gosh.
And I imagine Emily looking through this, she that's the one thing about architecture. The poetry, obviously, her poetry tells us a lot about her mind, but architecture and the environment that she was in can tell a story that no other avenue, it can be told in no other way other than the tangible environment that was around her, that we can understand her as a person a little bit more. And so there's a detail, the glass, the etched glass, and that door even tells us what hardware was on it. And even underneath that plaque that you saw in the original photograph, it's missing, but you can see the original finish of the door. So this tells us a world of things when we look at something like this. And we're going to be able to restore it. Other doors in the house were just either in a garage or up in the attic that now we're finding where all the homes for these doors were. And so that's sort of a game that we play. We know the openings and we can look at all the evidence, and there's a certain pattern that you see. And so we'll be able to put all these doors back in their original openings and put their original finishes on them.
There are a lot of doors lying around, aren't there?
There are a lot of doors lying around, but and this big opening that you're seeing off to the right, the left-hand side, was once a door that was an opening between the north and south parlor that Emily would have known, and those would have been closed off with doors. And sure enough, we pull a molding off that was put in the early 20th century, and there's a big pocket in there, and you can see evidence for the track of the door was still there.
Yeah.
And so we're able to take some of the old doors, and we don't have these particular doors, but we believe they would have been modeled around the other doors that are in the room. And so this is our restoration, a detail of our restoration drawing, showing how those doors will look when they go back.
And this is another glimpse of the future.
Yeah, I mean, I think what we're trying to show here is that there's still a master plan, and we're still checking off everything on the master plan. And this is part of the dream, to put the house back together, to bring the barn back, to restore the evergreens next door, and to restore its landscape, and I think including its gardens, if I understand correctly.
Right.
Emily was known as a gardener, and I think that's a very important part of her life. So at the end of the day, this is going to be very, very close to the way Emily knew it, and it's going to be an exciting thing to see.
Yeah, yeah. This is just a fascinating kind of quick journey through what's happening with this restoration, and we're going to want to document it the whole way through. So we'll have much more to share and to show and to say as we continue, because we probably haven't found quite everything yet. Yeah, I remember, well, it was only a couple of weeks ago, I think, when up on the third floor in what would have been the attic during Emily's lifetime, we saw flashing from the original Federal period hip roof. That's right. Yeah, that was.
What's fascinating about that too is you can actually see the line of the roof as it came up the side of the chimney. And what I would love to see someday with our computer technologies we have these days, I think one can put together a very compelling and accurate model of what this house would have looked like in different periods.
Right. Yeah. I know we could talk about this for hours and literally for days, but we can maybe leave a little time for participants to ask some questions. So is there any that have come in?
Let's move into some questions. There are quite a few actually already. One in the chat was wondering, did the Park family apply for the historic designation?
The way I understand it is that it was declared a National Historic Landmark just before the Parks sold the house, but it was, in a way, it was part of a concerted effort at the time to list authors' houses. So they may have had to provide some information, but I believe they were invited to have the house designated.
And Rebecca Taylor writes, Jane mentioned the cultural landscape report. Could someone speak in a little more detail about the preservation efforts related to the landscape, special outdoor features, etc.?
Yeah, a cultural landscape report is the kind of the landscape companion to a historic structure report for the building. So it does the same thing in trying to document the different periods of landscape architecture and changes with landscape features, gardens, the fences, how the grounds were used and how they were developed. So the cultural landscape report we have comes with recommendations for similar to the master plan for how to work on various aspects of the grounds. Much of our work up to now has been archaeological field schools with the University of Massachusetts for several years to try to learn more about the Homestead gardens, the gardens on the east side of the Homestead. But that report has a raft of recommendations for redeveloping the evergreen side, which was a little bit more of a picturesque landscape, as well as the Homestead side that was a bit more of a kind of a gentleman farmer's garden. So there is a lot of work to do there also. And that needs, in a sense, that also needs to be wrapped around what the work that's done on the structures, because of just the practical realities of construction and equipment and earth moving and tearing up the grounds. But the very next thing that's happening is to reinstate the path between the homestead and the evergreens that Emily Dickinson called a path just wide enough for two who love. And to Jeff's point about systems being involved, well, this is an opportunity to create conduits and connections between the homestead and the evergreens for electrical and data and drainage and all kinds of things. So that's another kind of layering that has to happen in this work.
Yeah, I loved hearing about the layers, all the layers. I also wondered if there's much interaction, I guess it'd be particularly for Jeff, between the restoration process and historical construction scholarship, if there are ever kind of discoveries that you have through your work that then can feed into the scholarly realm of history.
Well, I guess I view it all as scholarly. What we try to do is generally look at all archival information that we can get our hands on. And that archival information may be related to writings, it may be maps, it may be newspapers, even historic photographs, anything that we can get our hands on the archival side. And then we look at the physical evidence within the house and we merge those two together. We try to understand how whatever is shown on a map, for example, what is really out there, site plans, whatever, what is really out there in the field. Sometimes even there's like insurance maps that show changes over time, and those changes leave their marks on the building. And then, sometimes those maps really don't tell us much, but the physical evidence left in the building or on the building tells us a lot, and archaeologically. So we try to grab evidence in any way we can on the scholarly side, if you will, I call that the archival side, and then the physical side, and we merge those two together to tell the story. I hope that answers that question.
Yeah, I guess I don't want to take too much time, but I was wondering if it fed in the opposite direction sometimes.
Oh yes. Oftentimes we completely retell the story of a house. I mean, we're learning a lot about this house. At some point, I think Jane perhaps will write the definitive book on the evergreens and the homestead. I mean, we're discovering finishes and details and spaces that were previously unknown, and it rewrites the history of the house and therefore informs a lot about what we know about the world that Emily lived in.
A couple of years ago, I was asked to write an article about the houses, the homestead and the evergreens, and I used it as an opportunity to get information from the two historic structure reports and the cultural landscape report into an essay for a fourth that will be included in a forthcoming edition. However, because of this restoration project, my essay is already out of date. Because of things we've discovered.
That happens.
Well, frustrating and also wonderful.
But what's fascinating to me is that I think that a lot of architectural historians sadly don't actually get their hands dirty. And there are some, though, that do, or work with people that do. And I think that when you actually look at the artifact, that informs the architectural history portion of the history portion in a way that no other archive can, because the house or the building tells a story, and a truth is there that's undeniable. There's evidence of certain things in the house that have occurred that inform that story.
Mm-hmm. I want to keep these wonderful questions feeding through. So one says, Jeff and Jane, I've always found the homestead very intriguing in terms of its design and architecture. Was it any different from other houses one would see during that era?
Well, I can start because of something that's been said about the homestead for a very long time, and that it was either the first brick house in Amherst or among the first brick houses in Amherst. There are two or three others that are two or three others in Amherst that look like they were built on essentially the very same pattern, but it was an innovation at the time. But Jeff, I think you probably have more. You may.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that I guess almost every house is unique in a certain sense, but the thing that's really unique about this project is that there is this layering, and there's the house is kind of crazy. The original house was actually a two-family house. I think Emily Dickinson's grandfather, I believe, built the house, and then there was there was another family living in the back. And so the house was sort of bisected. That's completely, well, it's very, very unusual from my perspective. And then when Emily's father moved back in the house, they turned the house into sort of an 1850s Italianate villa. So that's sort of unique. That's happened in other federal period houses that I know of, but the way they did it is unique. And then, of course, there was this what they call brown decades post-Civil War decorative treatment to the house, and many changes to the house happened then. So this washing of different periods aesthetically that makes the house very unique and very unique to that family. So that's what's interesting to me is that Emily would have known at least two of those major periods, very, very different decorative periods in the aesthetic world.
And Susan Foster would like to know how you knew which bedroom was Emily's.
Well, I could sort of work backwards. The 1916 floor plan that Jeff referred to and that we saw in one of the early slides labels that room as Emily's. So that information came to the Parks from Martha Dickinson Bianchi, Emily's niece. Emily's niece Martha actually wrote a very extensive description of Emily's room, with specifically indicating where which room was hers, and actually even how the room was furnished, and in some cases, in some instances, how the furnishings were arranged. So that's the most direct and definitive evidence. And then there are, of course, some references from Emily herself about her, her views, her vistas.
And some folks are wondering about the evergreens. So what are your specific plans about keeping the original, even degraded fabrics, the paint ghosts, and the exact feeling that Austin has just left the room?
Austin and Elvis.
Not a fan.
Well, our thinking is that that the evergreens is such a unique artifact and such a unique atmosphere, with very little decorative change in there since the end of the 19th century, that the best, highest use, or the best, highest treatment, would be to conserve and stabilize what's there to the greatest extent possible. One thing that makes that even more appealing, rather than a bright, shiny restoration, is that the Homestead restoration, whatever we do in that building, and retaining the character of the evergreens, will give us two very different interpretive tools, and will complement each other because of their contrast. So it's I think that is probably the best approach we could take.
Wonderful, thanks. So we have time for just one more question. Maybe you could give us a rough timeline for the restoration work.
Well, in this case, it's ASAP. We are So we are kind of at the end of, and Jeff, you please jump in here. We're kind of at the end of taking away the 20th century and at the beginning of putting back in the 19th century. We're aiming to reopen in late spring, if possible. But if Jeff, if there's some details that you'd like to.
Well, yeah, I mean, right now we're, as I mentioned, we're trying to put building systems into the building, and the building systems, have to then be covered over. We've lost, we've not lost, but we've removed ceilings, and there's some structural framing things that we need to do to stabilize the house. But that will all be done, as Jane says, I'm sure by spring. But there is another little caveat here, because there's a few rooms. Remember that service wing that I mentioned earlier in that old slide? Well, that was an area that we just recently studied that wasn't part of this project. But it's really important in understanding how the service wing looked and functioned, particularly since Emily spent so much time in there. So I think the last push, I think, on the main homestead is to restore the service wing of the house. And we have a lot of evidence of what that was. So that's yet another exciting chapter that will unfold soon.
So that will probably, well, we think that might be the last chapter for the homestead restoration, but it's probably safer to say that restoration is a continuing effort, especially in the stewardship of a restored house. So this has just been a delight, a pleasure to talk more about this project with you, Jeff, and talk about things we've done before and some of the things that will come after. So we thank you very much for.
Well, likewise, as I mentioned, it's been an honor and a thrill to be involved. It's a journey of discovery that we're all on, and so all of you out there that have not been to the house, you will see something very special when you're finally able to make your way to the Emily Dickinson Museum. It's a wonderful gem.
Yes, thank you both. I wish we had time for more questions, but you all can feel free to post questions on the schedule event page. And I know we're all feeling excited about the work you're doing, so thanks for being here with us. And the Emily Dickinson Museum will reopen in late spring 2022, so we hope to see you all there. This program is part of the 2021 Tell It Slant Poetry Festival, and we have more programs for you coming up today and tomorrow. So be sure to sign up for this evening's headliner night featuring former U.S. Poet Laureate Tracy K. Smith and Tiana Clark, who reads from inside Dickinson's bedroom, as we were speaking of at the Homestead. We also bring you the final sessions of our Dickinson Poetry Marathon today and tomorrow, and we'd love your support as we reach the finish line. Lastly, the festival is free thanks to the generosity of our participants. So if you have not made a donation yet, please consider doing so. The donation link will pop up for you in a moment when you leave this program and can also be accessed from the menu in the festival platform. Thank you for being with us. And thank you so much, Jane and Jeff, and everyone. Please keep in touch.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.